Coach, a safety leadership fable. Written by Shawn M. Galloway. Narrated by Araceli Gote. I am very pleased to present the author, Mr. Shawn M. Galloway, who will be narrating the introduction personally.
Many years ago, at a refinery, days away from recognizing 3 years without a recordable injury, a terrible thing happened. A supervisor walking down some stairs within operations heard something squeak. Even though the contract with the labor union stated that management is supposed to direct rather than perform work, he found and picked up an oil can. He opened an access door to identify the source of the noise, bypassing a lockout-tagout procedure. Leaning in, now off balance, he placed his hand on a steel rod to stabilize himself. As the rod abruptly dropped down around a piece of machinery, it immediately amputated 4 fingers. For multiple reasons, this was a shock to the company. They thought they were good at safety and had a culture that would sustain these results. The company's president engaged me to assess the safety strategy and culture across the company. The first intervention was to join him at this location as he led a supervisor stand-down and flew in other location managers. The injured party was still in the hospital during this event. I sat as he addressed the audience of supervisors. The managers sat along the wall to the left, where the president began admonishing the seated crowd. "Don't you know what you are supposed to do? Don't you know what you aren't supposed to do with safety?" he gruffly inquired. Perhaps with a little more perceived political capital, an older supervisor stood up and responded, "Respectfully, sir, I don't believe that has been made clear to us." The president looked at the row of managers and questioned, "Is that true?" I watched as several managers raised their shoulders to indicate they didn't know. The brave supervisor followed, "Well, again, respectfully, if you all don't know, how are we supposed to?" This initiated a meaningful conversation. If you don't have everyone on the same page, this is precisely where you need to start. In my work developing leaders in client organizations, regardless of country, industry, or type of business, I regularly find that the most critical person to shape performance and culture is the first-line supervisor. Yet, these individuals are often the most undertrained, under-resourced, and underutilized leaders in the company. Far too many super employees become supervisors, and some eventually senior executives, without being developed into the type of leaders the organization requires to succeed. I wrote this book based on my direct observations to share tactics I have used with other leaders throughout my career. I wish you great success in your journey to becoming the best leader you can be. Don't wait on your company to invest in you. Invest in yourself and invest in those you lead. People need you, and how you show up for them makes all the difference. Shawn M. Galloway, November 2022.
Chapter 1. The Bare Knuckle Bunch. I am the luckiest monkey in the world. That's what my father always said and encouraged me to believe. And why wouldn't I believe it? We lived deep in a lush, green jungle with trees that stretched farther than the eye could see, even if you were standing on top of the tallest of them. And that's what we'd do. We'd perch atop the tallest trees on the tiniest of branches, picking rare and highly desired fruits and leaves that we carried down to the ground to be packed and sold to the other animals. As far back as anyone could remember, my father, his father, his father, and his father were picker monkeys, standing in the sky, as my father put it, to serve everyone in the jungle. I, Lucy, his eldest daughter, was part of the new generation of females to advance beyond packer monkey or sweeper monkey, ascending to the treetops as a picker monkey. I loved it. Yes, it was dangerous. We might be bitten by snakes or spiders, and monkeys accidentally fell from the trees every day. We were usually able to catch ourselves a couple of branches down, escaping with just a bruise or two. Tail tug was a more serious problem. This happened when we fell through several branches, flailing with our tails to grab a hold of something, finally snagging a branch but stopping so suddenly it really hurt. Then there were the farther falls, as we called them, that could leave us with a broken bone or two, and the really serious falls, which we didn't like to think about. We embraced the risk, for we were the treetop monks who went where no others dared in order to serve everyone in the jungle. Aaron and I, we'd been best friends since we were toddlers and went through picker training together, competed to see who could pick the most, climb the highest, and stand on the shakiest branch. We weren't the most profitable of troops to tell the truth. We were a little too macho for our own good. Our CEO, the boss, as we called him, was really good about making sure the sweeper monkeys constantly patrolled the branches, sweeping away snakes and spiders and other hazards. He was also good about giving the repair teams plenty of time and resources to shore up broken branches, pull away or patch up loose bark, and otherwise keep the trees structurally safe. But we weren't as good as we could have been with our safety. We were a bare-knuckle bunch. Chest pounders was what the other monkey troops called us. There was no tree too high for us to climb. There was no branch we wouldn't stand on, no matter how fragile, and we never gave much thought to harnesses and helmets, gloves, and the rest of the personal protective equipment. We knew we should have, and management hung posters reminding us to do so, but it just wasn't us. We prized our autonomy as much as we scorned safety equipment. Our corporate structure was loose and our hierarchy pretty flat. Anyone could swing over and talk with the boss because he spent half the day up in the treetops with us, encouraging us by his example. He knew many of us by name and would often ask about our family members. Work was challenging for everyone, not just pickers who raced up and down the trees all day. The sweeper monkeys were constantly leaping from branch to branch and tree to tree, broom and brushes at the ready, keeping us safe. And the packer monkeys below competed to see who could pack the most boxes of fruits and leaves the fastest and with the least product damage. Sure, they could have slowed down a bit and damaged less product, but they were just as competitive as we pickers and wanted every day to be a challenge. Our troop of chest pounders sailed along for years. Then, business conditions in the jungle changed drastically. Individual troops of monkeys could no longer survive as independent operators and were forced to consolidate. Even my troop, with our reputation for daring and high-quality products, was swept into the latest rounds of mergers and acquisitions. We were bought by a large organization called Plant-Based Premium Bites, or PBPB for short. Our CEO was given his swinging papers. We became just another troop at PBPB, operating as part of North Jungle Division, and were moved to an entirely different grove of trees. Things started off all right, and we were excited to be working in a brand new grove, a big one, with plenty of tall trees and enough precarious perches to keep our adrenaline racing. We quickly adapted with nary a change in our routine. In fact, the only difference was that our injuries were slightly down because, this being a never-before-picked grove, the branches and bark had not been damaged. And because the packing area was set up a bit to the side, falling branches or monkeys were less of a hazard to the packers. Our troop was more secure than ever, as our improved injury and productivity rates demonstrated. Chapter 2. Culture Clash. This all changed on the day, a day we all remember. It was strange from the moment we arrived and noticed the big locker that had been set up at the edge of our grove. It was stuffed full with brand new harnesses, helmets, gloves, steel-spiked boots, and other equipment we didn't recognize. Later, that same day, some monk no one had ever seen before swung into the grove, dropped to the ground, and began blowing a whistle. 5 minutes later, all work had stopped, and we were assembled on the ground or in the low branches, listening as our CEO introduced himself and the rest of the C-level leadership team, plus the president of North Jungle Division and some others, even someone who headed up the safety department, which we didn't have before. I think his name was Gil. The ceremony was brief, just a couple of minutes. They rushed through it fast so we couldn't catch half their names. Then they left, except the guy who blew the whistle. He went around handing out forms for us to sign, acknowledging, well, no one was quite sure what we were acknowledging. The form said, "I acknowledge that I have read and understood the above policies and procedures in their entirety and agree to abide by them." We figured it had to do with the stuff sitting in the new locker, but the whistle guy didn't actually say that. He just brusquely told us to all sign the forms, which he then collected and left. We never even knew his name, so we called him Whistle Guy from then on. And we never felt the need to remember the new CEO's name. We just called him Alpha. Yes, it was disrespectful, but we were great workers. We prided ourselves on getting the job done. We'd arrive early and stay late if we had to. We'd risk snake and spider bites. We'd climb crumbly bark. We'd race up or down the trees to help each other. And we always got the job done. That is, we always did until the day. After that, things began to slide. New levels of management popped in, so you couldn't just go up to Alpha and talk to him, like we could the boss. You had to talk to your supervisor. Then she went to her manager, then up the chain. Nobody really knew how many levels there were, although I did chat with the head of the safety department one day. He was puffed up with his title, but I kept pushing him and found out that he reported to North Jungle Production, which reported to North Jungle Operations, then Company HR, then Company Legal, then the COO, and finally Alpha. So he wasn't high up at all. As for us, the workers, we now had more supervisors. Before the day, there was one supervisor for each shift, watching over the pickers, packers, and sweepers. Now, there was one supervisor for pickers, one for packers, and one for sweepers. 3 supervisors for each shift, giving a total of 9 supervisors, plus a manager, North Jungle Production, over the 9. Suddenly, everything was different. We picker monkeys used to stack our equipment under certain trees and just take what we needed as we began climbing at the start of each shift. And we happily shared. When I was done with a harness, I'd toss it to a monk in the next tree or leave it where I knew someone would soon need it. Now, we found ourselves standing in long lines at the big locker to check out the equipment. And Locker Lois, that's what we called the monk who had appeared in the equipment locker the day after the day, seemed to think that it all belonged to her. She frowned whenever we requested something, asked us if we really needed it, and tried to get us to take less. She'd inspect each piece carefully before handing it over, marking down every dent, scratch, or tear before thrusting her clipboard at us to sign it out. Later, when we'd return it, she carefully checked it again, muttering darkly. We figured she was keeping a list of the monks who damaged the most equipment, and that one day a bunch of us would be fired. And it wasn't just the long locker line to get the stuff at the beginning of the shift. Since we were now personally responsible for the equipment, we couldn't share it with someone else who needed it. Instead, we had to swing all the way back down to the locker, stand in line, wait while Locker Lois inspected and checked it off on her clipboard, then climb back up. All the while, we were standing in line with the monk that needed the very same piece of equipment, but also had to swing all the way down, stand in line, endure Locker Lois's baleful glance, sign out the equipment, then climb all the way back up. Production took a nosedive because of all these changes, which made management unhappy. We knew they were unhappy because our supervisors started urging us to pick higher, pick faster, pick stronger. To do this, we stopped using the safety equipment altogether. Production shot up and management was happy until they got the quarterly safety report. All those falls, spider and snake bites, and other injuries must have made them unhappy because a billboard appeared next to the locker, jammed with posters illustrating how to use the safety equipment. There was also a poster announcing the PBPB Safety Slogan Contest, with a bunch of slogans we were supposed to vote on. There was a stack of paper, plus a bunch of pens, and you were supposed to write your favorite slogan on the paper, fold it, and stuff it into a little box. The candidate slogans were: safety is priority number 1. The key to safety is in your hands. Never give safety a day off. Safety first. A safe monkey is a happy monkey. Our tribe, the reason I work safely. The root of all falls is carelessness. By lunch, some monks had crossed out and rewritten the slogan, so they read, safety is priority number 1, plus 6 times 92 to the second power times 15z times 7 to the third power. The key to safety is in Locker Lois's hands. Never give safety a day off, but give me 3. Safety first, production firster, profits firstest. A soused monkey is a happy monkey. My salary, the reason I work. The root cause of all falls is gravity. And the monks had great fun inventing entirely new slogans of their own, the rudest of which, too rude to repeat, they wrote on the paper and stuffed into the little box. Monks grew frustrated having to waste all that time in the locker line and increase production. So, soon enough, they began bringing homemade safety equipment into the grove, hiding it up in the trees. If we caught a glimpse of Safety Guy in the grove, we'd all start grunting, safety, safety, safety. He thought we were cheering for him, but we were really warning each other to hide the homemade stuff because your pay would be docked if you were caught with it. But having to wait in the Locker Lois line meant falling behind in picking, and your pay would be docked. What's a monk to do? Chapter 3. Do as I say, not as I say. It wasn't just pickers who were peeved with management. Posters appeared in the packing area, urging monks to pack with pride and box with the best. And all the packers were given buttons imprinted with these slogans to wear. This offended them greatly because they were already proud of their work and already thought they were the best. With these new slogans, it seemed as if management was telling them they were a bunch of bums. Yes, the packers bruised more fruit and crushed more leaves than they should have. And yes, they could be sloppy about personal safety. They worked at a long conveyor belt under the trees, with different monks assigned to grab and pack specific fruits or leaves as they passed by. If they stayed late to finish up and their legs got tired, they would hang from a branch by their tails and pack upside down. Doing this for a long time caused rump inflammation, but no self-respecting packer would admit to having tired legs and rump inflammation, so they just kept on hanging and packing. Another problem was that the packer's conveyor belt was pretty long, and they didn't like having to go around it. The packers tried to arrange things so they didn't have to, but once in a while, they'd have to take the track. The younger monks especially did not like taking the track. Instead, they'd get a running start and slide under the gap in the belt. Or they'd get an even bigger running start and leap right over the belt, somersaulting or twisting in the air before they landed. And if they could grab a branch mid-leap and swing around it a couple of times before landing, so much the better. This was always treated as an event, and all the packers would stop, watch, and applaud. Then, other young monks would get in on the fun, sliding and leaping under and over the belt. Inevitably, some old-timer would start talking about how today's slides and leaps are not as artful or daring as the slides and leaps of old, and the debate would rage. Naturally, all this sliding and leaping produced more than a few injuries, with a slider's hair sometimes getting caught on the underside of the belt and the monk being dragged several feet until someone stopped the belt, or a leaper's ankle getting twisted or wrenched. But no one gave a grunt about that. Packers would much rather wear an injury as a badge of honor than a stupid actual badge that said, "Pack with pride." All this came to a stop after the day. That's when some baboon appeared, sitting in a branch by the conveyor belt, watching to make sure no one was sliding or leaping. Yes, Alpha hired an actual boon to be the conveyor belt's cop. He sat there under a sign that said, "Take the trek," pen and pad in hand, ready to take names. It's one thing that Locker Lois, Whistle Guy, and some of the other new faces were from other monkey troops. But to hire a boon to police us? That really made us mad because it seemed as if Alpha was saying, none of you monks can be trusted. Yet, even as management was telling the Packers to be careful, deliberate, and safe, their supervisors were urging them to pack, 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 and get more done every day. I talked with one of the Packers supervisors, a friend of mine, and asked how the Packers could be both slower and faster, more careful and more productive at the same time. "I don't know," she shrugged. "The manager is always showing us supervisors the production numbers and telling us if we don't improve them, Alpha may close down North Jungle. So I have to push the Packers to produce. I don't like it, but..." It's not just the Packers and pickers who were mad, confused, and worried. So were the sweepers. They went head-to-head with some nasty snakes and spiders. That's why they had to undergo a rigorous training program where they learned how to identify 100 different types of snakes and spiders, recognizing in an instant which were highly dangerous, slightly dangerous, annoying, or skippable. They also had to know which were on the endangered species list and couldn't be touched. For those guys, the sweepers set out orange cones to close off the branch and protect them. Once the sweepers learned how to identify all the different snakes and spiders, they had to master the art of sweeping them away. Some were easy, but others were pretty aggressive. They weren't going anywhere without a fight. The sweepers had to know each snake's and spider's fighting style. They were biters, spitters, squeezers, and how to counter it. They learned how to use brooms, brushes, nooses, forked sticks, and other tools to pin a snake's head down, which is quite the complex job. And they prided themselves on being willing to go snout to snout with any dangerous creature to protect the pickers. But ever since the day, their training was cut back, and like the pickers, they had to spend too much time in line checking out their equipment, arguing with Locker Lois over what they truly needed, and defending themselves should any of the equipment be returned damaged or dented, or just scuffed. To make matters worse, they now had less tree time because they had to conduct ground sweeps for anteaters. Anteaters haven't been seen in this part of the jungle for years, but since the day rolled around, sweepers have had to search for anteaters at the beginning, middle, and end of each shift, and then fill out a form attesting to anteater absence. This made absolutely no sense, so I went to see the sweepers' supervisors, all three of them, to find out why. None of them had a clue, so I checked with the manager, North Jungle Production, who also had no idea. He suggested I talk to a picker monk in South Jungle named John, who had been with PBPB since before it was PBPB, back when Alpha was just getting started in the C-suite, and long before we had been amalgamated in. So, on my first day off, I swung over the South Jungle, chatted with some friends, and asked them to introduce me to John. He was indeed an old-timer, and he loved talking about the way things used to be. Here's a story he told me about the anteaters. It seems that the very day Alpha was promoted to COO, he presented the CEO with a plan to reduce injuries and cost. Back then, they only picked and packed leaves, not fruits, and Alpha had come up with the idea of laying off all the picker monkeys and replacing them with leafcutter ants. These ants are capable of swarming up the trees, biting the leaves off, and carrying them away. There will be fewer injuries, Alpha explained to the CEO, because ants rarely fall, and they don't goof off like monks do. They do what the queen ant tells them to do. The CEO bought the idea, the pickers were sent packing, and the ants came marching in. They were good at their work, no doubt about it, but they wouldn't wear their safety helmets because the helmets squashed their antenna, which they used to talk to each other. This was a big deal because, as it turns out, they're little chatterboxes. And they wouldn't wear the steel-toed boots they were issued because the boots were made to fit carpenter ants, not leaf cutters, and they hurt. Apparently, some genius on Alpha's staff had assumed that any ant who could cut something had to be a carpenter ant. And here's where the anteaters come in. The presence of tens of thousands of ants attracted scores of anteaters, more than anyone had ever seen in one place. That's why the sweeper monks were told to be on guard for anteaters, and that's why the Anteater Absence Attestment form was designed. We've been using that form ever since, sighed John, even though the ants were fired for talking too much and the anteaters went away. I was puzzled. Doesn't anyone at headquarters wonder why we're counting anteaters when there aren't any around anymore? Don't they notice that the numbers are always 0? Once again, John sighed. Do you think anyone at headquarters actually looks at the Anteater Absence Attestment forms? Half the forms we send them just get stuffed into files. No one looks at them. I went back and explained this to manager, North Jungle Production. But he just shrugged and said, I don't care about the forms. My bosses are going bananas over production, so that's all I care about. Chapter 4. The Clueless Supervisor. Another big problem arose after the day. Personnel was shuffled around in order to staff some new groves, and they made me a supervisor. My title was Supervisor, North Jungle Pickers. I was delighted and loved pinning on my supervisor's badge every morning. But soon enough, I realized I knew nothing about supervising. I was a great worker, but being a great worker didn't prepare me for being a supervisor. And management didn't prepare me either. Their attitude was, here's your badge, here's your clipboard, go to it. I quickly discovered that go to it included making sure my pickers showed up for the training sessions that management had started running. Alpha and his leadership team had gotten really worried because PBPB, which was growing rapidly, was struggling both with safety and profitability. This was very troubling, for we were operating in a competitive jungle where other animals would happily eat our lunch. So, Alpha hired a noted safety consultant who had done a great deal of work with beehives. The consultant carefully studied our operation and then made a presentation to Alpha and his leadership team. He urged Alpha to adopt a very rigid command and control style of leadership. Everyone must be assigned to and trained for certain, very limited, well-defined tasks with safety procedures built into them. Absolutely no deviation should be allowed. I call this the Queen Team Strategy, the consultant explained. Everyone is told exactly what to do and must perform exactly as specified under the control of a very strong leader. He insisted that it's very safe and effective. Honey production is up 27% on average. Alpha, who loves being bossy, announced that PBPB would instantly adopt the Queen Team Strategy. He was quite enthusiastic about it, personally climbing the trees to scold monkeys who deviated from the program. Pretty soon, we had new safety posters featuring bees wearing our monkey safety equipment. Signs were nailed to the trees saying things such as, "Be safe," and "The busy bee is the injured bee. Take your time." And, "If you see a hazard, sting it." I was given jars of fancy honey to award to workers who enthusiastically embodied Queen Team, although I was never told what enthusiastic embodiment looked like. There was also a new metric called Sting a Hazard. Every time workers saw a hazard, they were supposed to fill out Form 975 Hazard Stung Report. The supervisor who turned in the most hazard stung reports would be rewarded. Naturally, the Queen Team Strategy was a total failure. That's because we monks, especially the pickers, are not drones. We're used to having some autonomy on the job. We're up there alone in the treetops. We have to decide if we will leap onto that shaky branch to pick some leaves, or if we will avoid other branches because the sweeper teams hadn't checked them in a while. And until Queen Team was implemented, we decided if certain fruits were too blemished to be worth carrying down to the packers. We really resented being told to carry down every piece of fruit, then finding out that half of it had to be discarded and sold at a deep discount to the leopards who use it for their line of change of spots, jelly and jam. The good part was that we had fun making fun of Queen Team. Quite a few of the monks showed up the day after the Queen team training session wearing yellow and black striped shirts with stingers attached to their rumps. They referred to our grove as the Hive, and my pickers addressed me as Queen Bee of the North. My buddy Aaron even gave me a pen showing a bee wearing a crown to wear at work. Queen team certainly reduced injuries, but it also pushed down production. So after about a month, it was all over. The Queen team signs and posters were taken down, and I was told to turn over any unused honey to Locker Lois. Meanwhile, I was struggling with being a supervisor. All my pickers knew me as well as my whole family. They loved my can-pick attitude, so they supported me right from the start. But it was hard to tell an older monk, a friend of Dad's, that he had to wear his helmet or he wasn't meeting his production quota. I couldn't just order him around. One time, I tried to get stern with a worker, telling a picker who used to babysit me and change my diapers that I'd report her refusal to follow the safety rules to the manager. She just laughed and said she'd report me to my mother. Since my promotion, I had made several requests to get supervisor training. I really wanted someone to coach me and help me become a great supervisor. Finally, I was told to show up at headquarters at a certain time to take a special supervisor seminar. I showed up early to meet my peers from the other jungles, which was great, but the seminar itself was a bust. It consisted entirely of a bored monk running through the corporate organizational chart, making it clear that we absolutely had to follow the chain of command, reading lengthy bios of Alpha and the rest of the C-suiters, and rattling off the names of the 86 forms we supervisors were expected to use, such as Form 569B, Quarterly Leaf Damage Assessment. Finally, I raised my hand and asked, "Are you going to coach us on how to be good supervisors?" Bored monk seemed perplexed. "What do you mean?" he replied. I put it into question form. How do I actually supervise someone? He sighed and said wearily, "Your job is to make your pickers do their job. You tell them what to do, then you monitor them. If they do what you've told them to do, fill out Form 352B, Employee Compliance Report, and send it on up. If they don't do what you've told them to do, fill out Form 352A, Employee Non-Compliance Report, and send it on up. If you have more than 10 Form 352A, Employee Non-Compliance Reports, bundle them into a Form 64D Bundle Report, Employee Non-Compliance, and send it on up. What if I have more than 10 excellent employees to report on? What form do I use?" "We do not have a form for a function that has never occurred. However, in the unlikely event that 10 or more employees demonstrate compliance excellence, use Form 64M Bundle Report, Miscellaneous Multiple Employee Activity Report." But how do I actually supervise them? How do I make them better workers, happier workers, better monks? Again, bored monk sighed. "Your job is to make your pickers do their job. You tell them what to do, then you monitor them. Use the forms accordingly, and don't forget Form 187Z, Request for Supplemental Training." "Training for supervisors to supervise?" I asked. "Training for pickers to pick," he answered. I left, armed with reams of forms, but thinking the seminar was a total waste of time. I needed someone to coach me on how to be a good supervisor, a great supervisor, like the boss, but he was long gone. And now, Aaron was gone too. He got fed up with Locker Lois, the anteater sweeps, and the rest of the PBPB nonsense. And when I told him what happened at supervisor's training with all the forms, he decided to get out of picking. He always liked technology, so he put in for a transfer to the tech staff at headquarters and was accepted. "It'll be great," he said. "I hate standing in line. I hate stupid rules, and I love fiddling with new gadgets. Plus," he said kiddingly, "now you've got a spy at headquarters." Chapter 5. Search for a Coach. On my next day off, I went to visit the boss, but it turned out he was on an extended vacation with his wife. His sister, who was tree sitting for the couple, told me that when the boss was feeling lost, He liked to chat with his friend, Solomon the elephant. That name sounded vaguely familiar, so I asked who he was. She explained that he was a trusted advisor to many of the top leaders in the jungle, an expert at guiding leadership and creating cultures of extreme engagement and ownership. I didn't know what that meant, but if the boss trusted Solomon the elephant, I trusted him. The sister gave me directions to where Soliphant, she explained that's what everyone called Solomon the elephant, hung out, and I swung off. Soliphant lived a long way off, and it took me a long time to get there. Fortunately, the boss's sister gave me good directions, and equally fortunately, Soliphant agreed to chat with me. When I told him I wanted to learn how to become a great supervisor, he said he would help me out. I will serve as your coach, he said. I will assist you in learning how to be a superior supervisor. You have spoken a lot about safety because that is what PBPB is emphasizing. But what you will learn goes beyond safety. That is because the tools used to improve safety are the same tools to improve quality, customer service, and other items. How can that be? I asked. Isn't safety safety, quality quality, and customer service customer service? Yes, Soliphant replied. In the sense that a tree climbing harness, for example, is specific to safety, but not in the sense that 99% of the time, when an organization is struggling with safety, it is also struggling with quality, on-time performance, customer service, and most everything else. Safety is a great indicator of leadership capability. If leadership is not good at something as important as safety, you can be certain they are struggling in other areas as well. I scratched my head over this. Imagine a work area with scrap littering the floor, Soliphant continued. Animals can slip on the scrap and get injured, so you might think this is strictly a safety issue. But why is that scrap all over the floor in the first place? This is a production issue, a quality control issue, and ultimately, a leadership issue. Having someone sweeping the floor takes care of the scrap from a safety point of view, but not from production, quality control, or leadership points of view. He continued, many leaders believe that what happens in safety stays in safety. They act as if safety exists in a bubble as a separate entity. That is a very limited way to think. Instead, you should think of safety as a window into management's mind and capabilities. Soliphant and I chatted for quite some time. I understood his point that safety is much more than an absence of injury and that the tools used to improve safety can be used to improve just about everything else in the organization. I was also eager to begin learning how to be a great leader by learning about the 4 areas Soliphant said I had to master. They were familiarize. In other words, know your monkeys and what motivates them and what leadership style and skills to deploy. But there is no best leadership style. How you lead is situational. You need to know where you are and what you are trying to accomplish. You need to know your monkeys and what is important to them. And you need to develop respect and trust so you can move the collective towards the goals. Focus. There are a lot of hazards, risks, and competing priorities in any business or culture. What single thing, if concentrated on, would make the biggest difference in improving both performance and overall culture? Feedback. You don't give feedback to change what has already happened. Instead, you give it to encourage effective performance in the future. All feedback must be timely and consistent, and it must be balanced, so monkeys know how the bosses will respond if future performance is desirable, and how they will respond if it is undesirable. Facilitation. Animals do things for a reason, which means that behavior, like company culture, is a byproduct. It's a byproduct of the individual choices workers make, of their superiors' behavior, and of the systems they work within. You don't change undesirable behavior by naming, blaming, shaming, or retraining. You change it by understanding why the undesirable behavior is happening, by figuring out what is making it difficult or impossible for the monks to perform as expected. Once you understand the why of behavior, you can improve the systems that animals work within. If the monks are able to perform the task as expected, the bosses should figure out how to make this repeatable. In other words, how to make it easy for the monks to perform properly. That's what facilitation means, making it easy. Soliphant thought it was a good idea to begin trying out the new leadership approach with safety. For one thing, protecting the workers is the right thing to do. It's also easier to get agreement on what needs to be done, especially when the troop is part of the solution and has ownership of the efforts. And, he added, when you see how well this new approach to leadership works in safety, you will start to see ways to use the same leadership approach in other areas. That's because when you change a company culture from have to want to, it's much easier to become excellent in every way. We could talk about these 4 areas forever, Soliphant said. But it is rather late already. Let's continue again sometime soon. I left, promising to return as soon as possible to begin learning about the 4 areas. I was excited, but realized that, as a supervisor, I had no power to put what I would learn into practice. As Board Monk had made clear, my job was to get the pickers to do their job, apparently by filling out forms all day long and making sure the pickers sat through the latest on-sites and off-sites. Meanwhile, management wasn't making my job any easier because Queen Team was followed by a parade of other silly safety initiatives, including follower to leader to follower, or FTL-TL for short. FTL-TL was cooked up by Alpha's leadership team, which got all excited by the latest research on birds. The leadership team explained to the CEO how individual birds take up the leading position at a moment's notice, suddenly turning the flock in a different direction, speeding it up or slowing it down, and so on. Then, after a while, a new leader spontaneously pops into place while the old leader becomes a follower once more. Birds fly very high in the sky, the team explained, often with treacherous winds current, but their safety record is excellent because of FTL-TF. Their presentation was filled with impressive stats and diagrams of bird flocks in flight. But Alpha, who believes in strong, top-down leadership, was dead set against the program. However, the latest injury report had frightened the leadership team, and they convinced him that something must be done. Alpha reluctantly signed on to FTL-TF, then immediately washed his hands of the program, leaving it entirely to his underlings to implement. The leadership team did a splashy rollout, even giving all the monkeys badges to wear that said FTL-TF. But FTL-TF flopped, largely because few monks would step up to be a leader, even for a moment. Most didn't want to stick their necks out when it was perfectly clear that Alpha was not behind this. When a few brave monkeys did step up to the lead, they were quickly booted back into place by their supervisors. "Don't be an idiot," they said. "This will go away soon enough." But we did enjoy mocking FTL-TF, which we jokingly said really means fat tomatoes, lunchtime fun. And my monks enjoyed kidding me when they learned that I was promoted to manager, South Jungle Production. Despite the fact that I was the most junior of supervisors in North Jungle, management was impressed by my inquisitive nature, my popularity among the monkeys, and my outreach, as they called it, to other jungles. So, when the South Jungle Production Manager was transferred to some other facility, I was given the job. During my remaining time in North, my monks addressed me as Lucy, Empress of the North and South. And on my last day, they threw me a farewell party during which Aaron, in from headquarters for the party, presented me with the group's parting gift. It was a crown inscribed with the words, "Please work safely today. My bonus depends on it." Chapter 6. There's more to safety than safety. I was thrilled to be promoted to manager, South Jungle Production. I was also terrified because I still didn't know how to supervise, let alone manage monks. And I knew that South Jungle was problematic. Its safety numbers were decent for PBPB, with South beating North on metrics such as sting a hazard from Queen Team. But its production figures were low, and they refused to budge. Some friends in North Jungle had advised me to decline the promotion, saying that South was like a prison, but I just couldn't pass up the opportunity. It's a challenge, I kept telling myself as I swung in that first day. It's a disaster, I couldn't stop telling myself after a few weeks there. North Jungle had been loud, busy, raucous, and even rude. South Jungle was silent, still, and polite. So very polite. I was always addressed as Manager Lucy, and when I was in the trees, branches were held steady for me as a sign of respect. The day I arrived, all the South Jungle supervisors came to greet me, praise me, and promise to assist me to the best of their abilities. But beneath the silence and sycophancy were festering feelings of anxiety and dread. You could see this in the South monks' reaction to the squad of reminder monks who wore silver sashes across their chest and clutched thick, nasty notice pads in their hands. The minders checked to see that each monkey was wearing all the required safety gear. Monks lined up early before the start of the shift to get into their gear, and they had to be suited up and checked by starting time. One of the picker supervisors, who always looked really angry, would stand over the minders as they did their checks. I called her Furious Face. South had also added some safety steps of its own. The minders made sure picker and sweeper monks stood within the designated jump zones before leaping onto a tree with the zones marked by white lines painted on the ground around each tree. They also made sure that, upon descending from a tree, each monk stepped into the designated landing zone marked on the ground in red paint. And to ensure the monk stepped rather than leapt off a tree, a horizontal blue drop line was painted around the base of each tree at a specified distance from the ground. The monks had to descend to this line, if not lower, before stepping off. There were many more safety lines and zones painted throughout South on the ground, in the trees, at the conveyor belt, and at the equipment locker. Should any monk stick even one toe over the line or deviate from all kinds of other rules, the minders would appear instantly, rip off the appropriate notice from his pad, warning, fine, or retraining required, and hand it to the offender. So, the South monks dutifully, if sullenly, wore all the required safety equipment and stood behind all the designated lines. But despite this emphasis on safety procedures, South monks still suffered plenty of injuries. I thought I'd talk to the monks about this to get their opinions on safety, but they were reluctant to open up and mostly just said that everything was fine. On the rare occasions that they pointed to a problem, it was always something out of South's control, like the maintenance or overhaul schedules set up by headquarters. Once in a while, it seemed as if a monkey was about to come and speak to me, but then she'd stop and hurry away when she saw a supervisor. If I asked the supervisor to find that monk and bring her back to speak with me, the supe would agree to do so, but never managed to return with the monk. I had this odd feeling that Furious Face or one of the other supes were somehow always hovering around, ready to swoop in should a monk approach me. One day, I stealthily made my way up into the trees and silently observed the pickers and sweepers. I could see that they wore all the required equipment, and properly so, even though it made them clumsy and slow. But once they reached their picking or sweeping spots, they had to remove some of the equipment and set it aside in order to work. They were constantly putting the ladder on and off their backs. Their bulky helmets got in their way when they had to poke their heads into tight foliage, so they took them off. And they had to remove any equipment strapped to their belts before hanging upside down to pick or sweep. All of this maneuvering took place in tight spots, and that's where they were most likely to slip or drop something on a monk below. Then, there were times when it was not just inconvenient, but actually a bad idea to use the equipment exactly as prescribed. Sometimes, putting a stepladder onto a branch to climb up and reach something on a tiny, otherwise inaccessible branch was very useful. But if the supporting branch had a big crook or a knot in it, using the ladder could make things more dangerous, not less. Other times, using the harness was a great safety measure. but not if some slimy creature had made the supporting branch as slippery as a greased gecko. Common sense should have told the monks what to do, but they used the safety equipment exactly as described in the thick manuals they received when they began working in South, no matter what. Those manuals themselves were part of the problem. They were stuffed full of instructions, way too many for any monk to memorize, so many pickers and sweepers lugged them up into the trees and often read them while walking along a branch, or even when leaping from branch to branch. Naturally, this led to a big increase in falls, tail tug, and farther falls. This became so common, monks started writing "leapt while reading" manual, saying you shouldn't leap while reading, as the incident cause in the accident report sheet. Another problem was the maintenance monks who came from headquarters and were a pretty sloppy bunch. They often left tools behind. If the monks could see the tools, they could avoid them. But if the tools were hidden under a big leaf or a bunch of foliage, they were invisible, and more than a few of my monks stepped on them and tumbled. They also got knocked on the head when tools the maintenance monks had left on a higher branch suddenly fell. Yet another big problem was rushing to keep up with the production targets, which a lot of monkeys did. They were caught between dueling dictates, work faster and work safer. It suddenly hit me. You could wear every bit of the required safety equipment, follow every single rule and procedure, and still get injured. Soliphant was right. There was more to safety than safety. Chapter 7. Who's in charge of this jungle? I brought up all these rules, the minders and notices with my supervisors at a meeting I called. Well, I had to call the meeting several times before it happened because they kept not showing up, offering excuses that ranged from plausible to laughable. I overslept. I had the wrong date. I heard a monsoon was coming and was busy preparing. I thought this was the day Alpha was visiting and was busy tidying up the grove. I was busy repainting the lines for the jump and landing zones, which was not their job. I was busy mending rips in the minder monks' sashes, also not their job. My favorite of all the excuses was offered by Furious Face, who said she'd lost track of time while following up on a reported sighting of an anteater. Of course, no anteaters have been seen around here for years. When I was finally able to get them all together to present my ideas, they praised my keen powers of observation and inspiring desire for improvement, then kept insisting that South Jungle had to keep all the rules because. South Jungle is different than North, said Furious Face. Yes, agreed another, our trees are different. That's not correct, I replied. North and South have the exact same 13 kinds of trees, mixed together, producing the exact same fruits and leaves. We receive the exact same amount of rain, and both median and mode tree height, as well as branch length and branch moisture factor, are exactly the same in North and South. I'm impressed by your command of the facts, said a third soup, but the sunlight here is more diffuse, which makes our trees grow differently than North's trees. More acute angles in some branches, Furious Face assured me, more obtuse in others, and the branch knot to crook ratio is 1.2% greater in South. Yet another piped up. Certain fruits here cling more tightly to the trees, and the tightly clinging fruits are more delicate, requiring more careful handling, said a fifth. Because of the differences in wind, bringing in moisture not accounted for in the rainfall figures, the leaves here are a little larger, giving the spiders more hiding places, said Furious Face, followed immediately by yet another soup who said, and our snakes are more aggressive. I had no time to dwell on that possibility, for they continued to bombard me with nonsensical reasons why South Jungle was so different than North, and I gave up. I really had no idea how to manage these supervisors or to sell them on my ideas. Or if not my specific ideas, at least my attitude about how our real job was to serve everyone in the jungle by making sure our monks could do their jobs. I didn't know how to persuade them, and I couldn't fire them or give them retraining required forms, so I was stuck. But by now, I knew why South was such a mess. First of all, it was a cobbled-together jungle. As PBPB grew, it usually kept together the monkey troops it absorbed. But when they opened South Jungle, they did the opposite, throwing in monks from all over the jungle. They kept transferring monks in and out of South, using it as a dumping ground for those who didn't work out elsewhere. And should any monks excel in South, they were transferred to another jungle. This meant South monks had no chance to work together long enough to get to know and trust each other. And they certainly didn't trust management, which they saw as the enemy. They whispered rumors to each other, rumors of how Alpha was spying on South Jungle by hiring detective chameleons who blended in with the leaves and listened to everything that was said. Rumors of how Alpha hired hummingbirds to flit in and out of the trees, keeping an eye on the monks. Rumors of how some hidden device in the helmets was recording the monks' movements through the trees. Rumors on rumors. New research shows that plant-based diets are bad for you, so PBPB is going to close. Alpha is going to be fired because he let slip some embarrassing personal information in an interview. A few okapis got sick on South Jungle leaves, and there is going to be a big recall. We are going to be replaced by giraffes. This made no sense at all because giraffes don't even live in the jungle. The only ones who felt comfortable in South were the supervisors who treated the jungle like their personal fiefdom. Right from the start, led by Furious Face, the most senior of the South Soups, they bullied the pickers, packers, and sweepers, telling them that they, the supervisors, were the only bosses who mattered. The average manager only lasts a couple of years, they told the workers, but we will be here for your entire career, and we're the ones who tell upper management what's going on here. If we feel you fit in, upper management feels you fit in. They didn't have to add, so you better do what we tell you or else. That was well understood. Although the Soups rule the South, they decided that they needed to excel at something to ensure their job security. They chose safety. With the help of a cooperative South Jungle manager, several managers back, they devised new rules for South, painted the lines, set up the minder monks, and pushed for safety, safety, safety. It paid off in the sense that South won several awards for hitting safety metrics, and the Soups were given bonuses and awards. Alpha praised South Jungle for winning safety metric contests and personally handed out the awards, but he was also unhappy about South's low production numbers. Lower production meant lower profits, so Alpha and his team began throwing one production initiative after another at South. First, there was this ridiculous hamster cheeks idea, which required the pickers to wear a special helmet that had 2 cages attached to it, one hanging down by their right cheek and the other by the left. The monks were supposed to put the fruit and leaves into these cheek cages, but the helmets were already too cumbersome without adding cheek cages. Then, there was the fill your pouch, an idea brought to us by a consultant who had made his reputation working with kangaroos. Each of the South pickers was given a large pouch worn around the neck so it was hanging down in the front to put the picked fruits and leaves in. The idea was that this would allow them to pick a lot more before heading down to packing. The idea was sound, but the pouches were poorly cushioned, causing the fruit and leaves to be damaged. And the pouches were unwieldy because they had to be worn on top of all the safety equipment. This really slowed the pickers down. There were also incentivizing initiatives such as Shift Forward, which would give weekly massages for a month to the shift with the best production numbers, and Meals by Manager, which would have the jungle's manager cook and serve lunch to the shifts that hit certain yields. I had to sit in on meetings at headquarters where these initiatives were discussed, discarded, or finalized. I then served on the rollout teams but wasn't allowed any input, and these initiatives never jibed with the conditions in the trees in South. The only one that even had a chance of working in our area was Zigzag, designed to save the pickers from having to go down and up the trees so many times a day. Instead, they were to collect what they normally collected, then go to a zigzag station set up in the trees and place what they picked in a bucket. The bucket would then be hung on ropes that went from one tree to another in a zigzag pattern, working their way down to the ground, like a series of zip lines. It was a good idea. The buckets were well designed to protect the fruit and leaves, and the ropes were sturdy and strategically placed. But when the buckets went from one tree to the next, they had to be transferred to the next rope. Unfortunately, The hooking, grappling, whatever it was device that was supposed to do the transferring didn't work well. Buckets would tip, causing fruit and leaves to fall, and buckets would knock into each other, causing them to break and the contents to fall out. It got so bad that management started tracking this with a ZZ droppage rate metric, and the minder monks on the ground had to make sure no one stood or walked under the zigzag lines, for they might be hit on the head. They marked the danger zone with painted yellow lines and handed out warning, fine, and retraining required notices to those who crossed the yellowed lines. I went around all over South encouraging the monkeys to come up with suggestions for improving the zigzag lines. In North Jungle, the monks would have come up with all kinds of ideas, some of which were actually serious and might work. But in South, I got nothing but silence, a kind of sullen silence, as if I was endangering them by asking for input. My supervisors were even less helpful. They promised to support me in every way, but came up with all kinds of excuses whenever I called meetings or asked someone to dig up information so I could write plans I wanted to pass up to headquarters. In fact, the soups did everything they could to undermine me. They spread rumors that I was only here temporarily. They said I wasn't really the manager, but that I was a corporate spy who didn't even work for PBPB. The craziest rumor of all was that I was actually Alpha in disguise. Meanwhile, they crossed their campaign for dominance, reminding the monks that while I was only going to be a manager for a few years, they would be there forever. They told the workers I was a blabbermouth and would repeat anything they told me to the supervisors. And if any monk dared to stand up for me or come to me to report a problem, the soups would give him their crappiest job possible, like putting up woodpecker holes in the trees or lugging bins of rotten fruit out to the hyenas for recycling. I was totally lost. I had no idea what to do. If I had really wanted someone to coach me to be a great supervisor, I was desperate to find a coach now that I was a manager. Chapter 8. Just use it. As a manager, I got to meet lots of monks from headquarters. And right away, I heard rumors that Alpha was furious that the safety numbers continued to be alarming. All of the safety metrics, bites, falls, tail tug, lost worker days, production stoppages due to injury, were problematic, to say the least. Not a single monk believed that Alpha gave a gnat's hiccup for our safety. For one thing, he had cut back on sweeper teams. They used to do a big sweep before each shift, knocking spiders and snakes out of the trees, and then run sweep patrols continuously throughout the shift. Now, the sweeper teams were only sent out at the beginning of each shift. Not only did they spend less time sweeping, but they were trying to do their job while we were trying to do ours, which caused a lot of confusion. And we were continually battling the snakes and spiders that crept into the trees after the initial sweep. Alpha also cut back on the repair budget, which meant that we were forced to climb trees with crumbly bark and leap onto branches that had more than a few cracks. It was pretty clear upper management didn't care about our safety, but there was rumbling out in the jungle. Some of our big customers didn't like the idea of buying products from an Injury Inc., which is what they called outfits that didn't protect their workers. A friend at headquarters told me that every time Alpha got another safety report, he would pound the table growling, "Why don't they just use their safety equipment? Just use it and keep our customers happy." That, apparently, was the genesis of the next great idea. One day, Whistle Guy swung into South Jungle, gathered us together, and announced, "There's a new safety program. It's called," he stopped to check his clipboard, "It's called Just Use It!" Exclamation point. Whistle Guy and Safety Guy, who stood by his side, handed thick notebooks to the South Jungle supervisors and me. "Your manager and supervisors have the new forms. New posters will go up this afternoon. And here to explain this is Bob from North Jungle Safety." "It's not Bob," said Safety Guy, a little peeved. "It's Bill. My name is Bill, and I'm not from North Jungle Safety. I'm head of North Jungle Safety." "Okay," said Whistle Guy. "Here's Bill." Bill launched into a lengthy presentation of Just Use It. The gist was that we were to use all of our safety equipment all of the time. Put it all on when we arrive, keep it all on until we leave. Meanwhile, some monks from headquarters were laying out complete suits of safety equipment for pickers, packers, and sweepers. There was more of it than ever, but just looking at all the stuff made it instantly obvious that just use it was a complete joke. Here's what a new, full set of safety equipment for pickers consisted of: helmet, heavily padded gloves, shin and arm guards to protect against bruises, bites, and thorns, elbow and knee pads, steel-clawed boots for climbing, harness to be worn around the shoulders and belly, stepladder to be strapped to the back for use in the treetops, broom to be strapped to the back, and a brush to be attached to the belt for sweeping spiders and snakes, whistle to hang around the neck for summoning help, snake bite kit to be attached to the belt, left side, spider bite kit to be attached to the belt, right side, goggles to protect the eyes with flip-down infrared lens to improve vision in dark areas, camera to be attached to the helmet for scanning the sky for eagles who like to buzz monkeys, olfactory sensor to be attached to the helmet to detect the odor of a certain dangerous snake, auditory device to be attached to belt which emits a sound designed to drive away certain spiders, tail tug reducer to be worn around the buttocks and lower part of the tail. Nobody, not even safety guy, understood how the leather and canvas tail tug reducer contraption was supposed to work. And nobody volunteered to put it on, drop from a tree, and see what happened. Several monks did, however, shout out nicknames for the gizmo, with the diaper quickly emerging as the winner. Safety guy chose a few volunteers and timed them as they put on all the equipment as fast as they could. "We're establishing a safety dress time today for a baseline," he explained. "I'll be back every week to do another timing, and we'll track the improvement in safety dress time over time. That's going to be a big metric for PBPB." I don't know about the metric, but wearing all that stuff made it nearly impossible for a monk to climb and pick. The gloves were way too thick, so you had to keep pulling them off to pluck leaves. The steel-clawed boots could be driven into the trunk and did give you some stability, but they chewed up the tree, making things unsafe and hurt your toes and ankles. Having both a stepladder and broom attached to your back, with a brush in your belt, was incredibly cumbersome. The heavy-duty elbow and knee pads were better suited to cave miners than pickers who needed much more flexible equipment. The helmet top camera never worked properly and, well, you get the idea. To make matters worse, it took way too long to get all of that equipment on and off. My supervisor started harassing the monks about the equipment. "You have to wear it all," the sup said over and over, "so we can fill out Form 81, employee certification of safety equipment donning every day." In addition, they had a picker, packer, and sweeper practice putting their equipment on and off, and then had these same monks volunteer for the safety dress time metric test every time safety guy came back. The metric certainly improved over the weeks, but they were measuring the wrong thing. They should have been measuring how useful all that stuff was, not how fast we could put it on. They should have been looking for the link between their policies and the desired results, not just thumping themselves on the chest over some nonsensical metrics. Production dropped, safety did not improve a bit, and within a few months, Just Use It went the way of Queen Team, FTLTL, and the other demotivators management dumped on us. The only good part of Just Use It was that the device for picking up the odor of that dangerous snake actually worked, so monks liked wearing it. But management was not metricing that, so broken detectors were not replaced, and they were eventually forgotten. Chapter 9. A very frustrated monk of mention. It was just a matter of time before something terrible happened in South Jungle. It was always a matter of time in South Jungle, wasting time, scrambling to get things done on time, trying to make up time, wishing for more time. It was always about time, and there was never enough of it. Workers stood in long lines waiting at the time clock, the equipment lockers, and the jump-off points for the trees, waiting for the zigzag baskets to be fixed, waiting for the safety meetings to start because safety guy was always late. Workers wasted time waiting for training on how to use the equipment, then wasted more time standing in line to get signed off on that training. They wasted time standing in line at the first aid station because they continued to get injured. Many of them wasted time pretending to work strictly according to the rules whenever a supervisor came by. Some of them wasted time trying to curry favor with the supervisors. Others wasted time hiding from them, especially from Furious Face, who never found an action she couldn't criticize. Meanwhile, I was spending way too much time at headquarters, suffering through endless meetings that seemed to lead to nothing except the next meeting. I was there so much because some of the higher-ups told me I was a monk of mention, a candidate for advancement who needed to show her snout at headquarters as often as possible. When back at South Jungle, I was swamped with paperwork, made worse by the fact that Alpha had outsourced the secretarial work to a troop of squirrels as a cost-cutting measure. The squirrels were diligent, but no one could figure out their filing system. They stashed stuff everywhere, and if they weren't there to retrieve it for you, you'd never find it. Since I did a lot of my paperwork after hours, I was always searching high and low for some form or file I desperately needed. A lot of the paperwork was due to the fact that South Jungle went through a wave of retirements. A large number of old monks were being replaced by young monks and by misfit monks transferred in from other jungles. All of them needed to be trained, and we couldn't rely on institutional memory to help out. Injuries were up, and it was no surprise because we had all the standard indicators for increased injuries. More young employees, more male employees, more untrained employees, a stressful environment, employees feeling extreme pressure to perform. The production target had been increased by 25%, and employees worried about their jobs. New monks were rushed through training, and even though they didn't always learn what they were supposed to, the trainers signed them off as being qualified. They were cross-trained, with pickers learning how to be sweepers, packers learning picking, and so on, without any regard for what they were qualified or able to do. It took a special breed of monk to stare down a poisonous snake or stand on a slim, shaky branch to reach for fruit. Heck, a lot of the trainers themselves weren't qualified to do their jobs because they were new monks who were rushed through their own training and didn't have any practical experience at all. The only thing all this hurried training and cross-training really did was produce a better utilization metric, which made headquarters happy. No one monitored the training, and no one seemed to notice that a bunch of retired monks had been pressed into service as training temps. It was total chaos, with one trainer teaching from the book, another from the tiny bit of experience she had gained in the past 2 weeks, and a third from years of experience doing it the old way. There was no longer any single approved way to perform any task. Instead, there were multiple best and often worst practices. Meanwhile, the supervisors doubled their efforts to dominate South, which generated more paperwork in the form of write-ups, warning notices, and complaints. Plus, there were more injury reports because the stress was literally causing monkeys to fall out of the trees and get their tails caught in the leaf compressing machines, and complain about dizziness and hearing loss caused by the high-pitched whine coming from that worthless eagle cam, and strain their arms trying to hoist themselves into their harnesses rather than asking someone to pull the straps for them as they were supposed to do. They were always rushing to get more picked. I kept trying to communicate my values and priorities to my workers, but the supervisors seemed to censor the communication. It was my job to set the tone for South Jungle, but the supervisors turned a deaf ear to me. With South being such a mess, I wondered why in the world I was a monk of mention. I later learned it was primarily because my paperwork was always filled out and sent in properly and promptly. This was a direct result of the monkey here, monkey do phenomena. Like everyone else, from the newest hire to the C-suiters reporting directly to Alpha, I couldn't help but do what I heard my bosses talking about. Whatever they were talking about seized my attention, even if it was only talk, not directives or orders. My bosses jabber-jawed about the importance of paperwork, so I got mine done promptly and properly. This made them happy, and even though South Jungle was underperforming, it made me a monk of mention. I realized how much I was caught up in the monkey here, monkey do phenomenon late one night, when I was digging into old accident reports. Why, I asked myself, was I wasting time looking through old, musty paperwork about things that happened way before my time? Because I heard that the COO had been saying he couldn't understand why monks were injured when we had so many safety rules. So I decided to try to figure it out for him. What I learned instead was how worthless those reports were, at least in South Jungle. When I was a picker, I had watched some friends fill out accident reports and had written up several of them myself as a supervisor in North Jungle. We usually wrote a couple of paragraphs explaining what had happened, but as I went through years' worth of accident reports for South, I could see that they had all been blanded out, shrunken down, and stripped of helpful information. They just said things like tail tug and bruised knuckles on right hand, with no explanation of how the injury occurred, what the worker was doing right before being injured, or what the conditions at the scene were like. Just a brief, bland description of the injury. How could you learn how to prevent injuries if you didn't know how they happened, what system or systems had failed? How could upper management design appropriate safety controls or initiatives if they were relying on this non-info? And was it just South Jungle blanding everything out? Were the other jungles doing it as well? Did leadership know about this? Were they deliberately closing their eyes? I didn't know about that, but I did know that the lack of incident information wasn't stopping the tsunami of initiatives. The latest, called Measure, 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 or MMM for short, was about as ridiculous as the rest. MMM was for the sweepers and required them to carry a clipboard in addition to their other equipment and record numerous measurements. They were told to write down the circumference of every branch before stepping on or hanging from it, to take a temperature reading to assess branch moisture, and calculate the distance to an adjacent branch of equal or better diameter and branch moisture, in case the branch they wanted to step onto proved to be weak or unsteady. "This is crazy," the sweepers said to each other. "We spend half our day measuring, and while we're measuring, the snakes and spiders slither and scamper to other branches. Then we have to chase them, which means measuring all over again." In just a few days, they figured out how to get around MMM. At the beginning of each shift, they put an already filled out form on their clipboards. They didn't bother measuring anything during the day unless a supervisor came by, and then they only pretended to measure. At the end of the shift, they wrote their names and the date on the pre-filled form and handed it to the supervisor. The supervisors competed to collect the highest number of forms, as form completion and form collection were the two metrics on which supervisors were judged for MMM. No one did anything with the forms or data, but Alpha awarded the winning South supervisor with a trophy and a paid vacation for most forms completed and collected. I knew what was going on, but just sighed. What was the point of telling Alpha that the forms were nonsense? By the time anyone noticed the forms had been faked, leadership would be onto a new initiative and MMM would be forgotten by everyone. That is, forgotten by everyone except by the sweepers who had always secretly referred to MMM as meaningless, maniacal micromanagement. Chapter 10. A Treasured Visit. Being manager of South Jungle Production was a real pain in the rump. Luckily, Aaron's new job in the tech department at headquarters had him testing different tools and initiatives, so he was out in the field a lot. Whenever possible, he'd swing by for a visit. This particular day, he brought with him a couple of what he called treasures. "The first," he said grandly, "is the latest picture." And he handed me a picture of himself, his wife Kristen, and their little twin toddlers, Dawn and Nadine. "From your weekend at the seashore?" I asked excitedly. I wish I had been there. I looked at the picture. The girls are adorable, your wife is adorable, and you're adorable too. "I also brought you the latest joke." "Not another two monks walk into a sparrow's nest joke, I hope." "No," Aaron assured me. "This one's actually funny. It's a new rule they're working on at headquarters." He waved a paper in the air saying, "I swiped this, and I quote from that which I swiped. Pickers, when in the trees at or above the second branch level, shall be required to calculate the jump safety factor before initiating a leap from one branch to another branch, should said branches be separated by a distance equal to or greater than 10.2 inches. I interrupted. "Why 10.2 inches? He replied, scanning the paper. Ah, right here in the footnotes. 10.2 inches is the average picker monkey's stride length. Who knew? It gets better, Aaron assured me. Pickers also have to figure out if one branch is higher or lower than the other. Then, according to what it says here, and I again quote, should said branches occupy the same horizontal plane, the picker is to check the horizontal plane equality attestment box on the calculation sheet. Should the said branches not be on the same horizontal plane, the picker is to enter the branch horizontal misalignment number into the equation, along with the diameter measurements for each of said branches at precisely the springing point on the leaping branch, plus or minus no more than 1.5 inches, and at precisely or not more than 3.2 inches from the intended contact spot on the landing branch. Aaron stopped reading to say, who comes up with this stuff? He continued, and right here it says you have to add all that, plus the branch flexibility factor, wind speed, and temperature into a formula, along with the number of hours and minutes that have passed since you first went into the tree. I guess the idea is that the longer you've been up, the more tired you are and the less leapable. Well, I said, just trying to calculate all that will tire me out. Yeah, a picker will probably get 2 leaves picked in a day if he has to figure all this out. Oh, hey, I swiped something else. This, he said, waving a different sheet of paper in the air, is a transcript of a presentation a very, very, very high-priced consultant made at headquarters a few days ago. This is a gem, and I quote to you right from the beginning of the presentation. Aaron cleared his throat and now spoke like a commercial pitchman. You've picked all the low-hanging fruit. How are you going to move the needle? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. What you need is a paradigm shift. You need to get everyone out of the box and start blue sky thinking. If they aren't all giving 110%, you need to circle back, dive deep, and peel the onion. Really lean into this and ask the tough questions. Address the elephant in the room and help employees see the value proposition to answer the what's in it for me question. At the end of the day, you need change agents who are all singing from the same sheet of music to take you to the next level. We need to make synergy and inclusion the new normal. So, let me tell you about this program that would get employees to sustainably step up to the plate and... By now we were both laughing hysterically. Did anybody buy this nonsense? I asked. No, it's not nonsense, insisted Aaron. It's pure genius. This guy gets paid a lot of money for saying absolutely nothing. This is a work of art. Yeah, a work of art in the BS movement, I answered. We chatted and laughed some more. Then Aaron invited me to dinner the next night and swung off. I wished we had more time together. Chapter 11. A Step Forward. For a long time, I had been trying to get the South Jungle workers engaged in, well, anything. Back in North Jungle, we felt the grove belonged to us, and its success was our success. But here in South, no monk took ownership of anything. That is, no one except the Soups, who wanted it all. I kept pushing headquarters for permission to try something new, and was finally given the okay to set up a special safety team that would engage the workers in the process of improving safety. I called it Safety Team Employee Participation, or STEP for short. The idea was to invite the best picker, packer, and sweeper monks to join the STEP team. They would go out and talk to the workers to get their unfiltered ideas about things such as, what should we be focusing on here in South? Which tasks are more likely to lead to injury? When do things not go according to plan? Which safety equipment is working and which is not? Which processes, procedures are helpful and which are not? Which safety initiatives have been helpful to you and which have not? Have you seen any hazards that have not been corrected? What are your concerns and suggestions? I wanted to find out what the workers were thinking about safety and then actually do something to improve it. I really wanted to do something to get the workers to feel that the jungle was theirs, that their input, and their safety mattered. So I spent a good chunk of time chatting with the South monks to figure out who was willing to speak up, who had influence among the others, who had been around long enough to understand how things worked here, and who was not a supervisor. Based on their behavior to this point, I didn't want any of the supervisors on the team. I made my selections and sent a list of 10 names to headquarters. 2 months passed before the list was approved, which seemed awfully long. Had headquarters changed its mind? I was excited to finally get the list back stamped approved. Then I read it. Someone had crossed out all of my names and replaced them with 10 completely different ones. My friends at headquarters told me it was my very own supervisors who had been responsible for the changes. Working through their own friends on high, my supervisors used excuses like, "This monk is the best packer and should spend all her time working," and "This monk is the only one who can repair the zigzag lines and can't be spared," to eliminate my choices. Then they replaced them with 10 voluntold, monks who didn't even know they were on my step team until I informed them. I scheduled a meeting with the voluntold, which I had to reschedule several times because the supervisors came up with every excuse possible for not allowing the 10 to come, from "I need her for the anteater sweep" to "Today? That meeting's today?" Finally, I got my group together and introduced them to the concept of step. Even though they were new monks who didn't know much about South, they weren't change agents, had no influence among the others, and were voluntold rather than volunteers, they seemed eager, and they were especially pleased with the big pizza I had ordered for lunch, a monkey favorite, bee pizza with a honey glaze and pollen dough. We were busy making a list of questions the steppers would ask the workers when, suddenly, Safety Guy swung into the meeting. I hadn't invited him, but was delighted to see him. "Phil! Everyone, this is Phil from North Jungle Safety." "It's not Phil," said Safety Guy, a little peeved. "It's Bill. My name is Bill, and I'm not from North Jungle Safety. I'm head of North Jungle Safety." "Sorry, but I'm glad you're here." "I don't mean to interrupt your meeting," he began. "It's a safety meeting," I interrupted. "It's a new safety concept called STEP. That stands for Safety Team Employee Participation," I said proudly. He seemed unimpressed. "I didn't know that, but since you're having a safety meeting, technically, it's under my department." "Aren't you North Jungle Safety?" "I am, but I handle safety for all the jungles." "Have they moved you up to headquarters?" I was puzzled. Surely if safety had been made a PBPBY thing, I would have heard about it. "No, I'm still heading up North Jungle Safety, but we cover safety for all of PBPB." "Oh." I was disappointed to learn that PBPB considered the safety department so unimportant. It was buried way down in North Jungle. "But you must have a much larger team now that you're handling all of PBPB?" "No," he replied, a little bit embarrassed. "Same size. I don't mean to interrupt your meeting. I just heard that you ordered pizza from a vendor not on the list of vendors approved by safety." He dumped a stack of papers on the table. "Here's a form 444F waiver, ingestion of non-safety approved outside vendor food, for each of you to fill out. Good luck with, the safety thing you're doing." With that, he swung out. Much later, I learned why Safety Guy was so uninterested in our STEP safety program. It's because he was just a paper pusher. When it came to safety, headquarters made all the decisions. If a safety initiative wasn't created by someone way up high, it was filed and ignored. If someone asked about a safety initiative they had written up and submitted, they were told that headquarters was already working on something similar, which would be announced sometime next year. It was nice that the big bosses were thinking about safety, but, as we saw time and again, they had absolutely no idea what the workers needed and no concept of how the needs varied from jungle to jungle, grove to grove. Most of the higher-ups rose through the exec prep program and never actually worked on a tree or even near a tree. I was hoping to change that with STEP.